So we concluded last class looking at this protein hemoglobin. We know that hemoglobin has this quaternary structure, and the purpose of hemoglobin is actually to take this heme ligand that is on each of the individual tertiary structures and bind oxygen to deliver it through the body. So when we're thinking about just this idea of binding oxygen, it's important to think about the body in terms of two places, okay? So we think about the body, oh, that was really ugly. We didn't want that to happen. We think about the body in terms of the lungs, okay? And you can think of like, air, oxygen coming from the air that we breathe into the lungs, okay? And then we can think about the body. Now, obviously, the lungs are part of the body. Okay, so the lung tissue needs to breathe as well. But right now, let's just think of air coming in at the lungs, right? About 27 to 29% oxygen coming in at the lungs and being delivered to the body. So, what is it that is delivering the oxygen from the lungs to the body? Well, that is hemoglobin. Okay, so there's some things that are really important that you see in the lungs and in the body, and I'm going to do those things here in red. Okay, um, in the lungs, okay, you have a lot of oxygen. Okay, so you have a high partial pressure. Okay, because there's more than just oxygen, so we call it a partial pressure. High PO2. That means there's a lot of oxygen in the lungs. Okay, if there's a high PO2, that means there's a low pressure of CO2. Okay, so these are inverse. Okay, whenever you have high O2, you always have low CO2. Okay, and that just makes sense, right? We take in oxygen for Krebs cycle and we blow out carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide means that Krebs cycle has already happened. So you have a high pressure of O2, partial pressure of O2 in the lungs, which means you have a low partial pressure of CO2. Now, wherever you have low CO2, okay, something else happens. Okay, anywhere you have CO2, and this is just going to be a little side comment over here. I don't want to do it there. I'm going to do it, well, I'm just going to talk about it. Anywhere you have CO2, you have that CO2 having the potential to react with water. Okay, and when CO2 reacts, actually, you know what? I am going to draw it because I think it's a really powerful thing for you to see. Okay. I'll do it over here. So wherever you have CO2, like in the body, okay, that CO2 has the ability to react with water. And when that CO2 reacts with water, it forms this equilibrium with an acid that's produced, bicarbonate acid. Okay, carbonic acid. So because of the presence of this H, we can think of the presence of CO2 as actually something that will decrease the pH. Okay, go back to your notes on pH. So anywhere where you have low CO2, okay, you are going to have a higher pH, which means it's more basic. Okay. Because low CO2 means not a lot of CO2 reacting with the water. If not a lot of CO2 is reacting with the water, we don't have a lot of carbonic acid. Okay. If we don't have a lot of carbonic acid, we have more of a basic situation or a higher pH. And there's something else that's happening in the lungs. Okay. We have a low temperature relative to the body. Okay, at the body we have a lot of metabolic activity happening. All those cells are taking in that oxygen and doing Krebs cycle and producing ATP, and that just general process is going to increase the temperature of the body relative to the lungs where the oxygen is just coming in. Okay, so this is true of the lungs. Okay, and now I'm going to do the body in a different color. So in the body, we have a low partial pressure of O2. okay? Because we are not taking in oxygen, right? Those tissues aren't directly exposed to the intake of oxygen the way the lungs are. And if we have a low partial pressure of O2, we have a high partial pressure of CO2, because that's where Krebs cycle is really happening. Now remember, the lungs are the body. And if we have a high partial pressure of CO2, we have this reaction happening where the CO2 is reacting with the water to produce carbonic acid. So what do we have then? We have a low pH. And in the body, we have a lot of metabolic activity, a lot of Krebs cycle, a lot of ATP being produced. So we're going to have a high temperature. So these conditions of the lungs versus the body is something for you to really, really, really pay attention to, because that's going to affect how hemoglobin binds to oxygen. And that's really where we need to go next. So remember, in the lungs, we breathe in, boom, a lot of oxygen, meaning we have a low amount of CO2, low partial pressure. Okay. If you have a low CO2, we don't have a lot of CO2 reacting with water to produce carbonic acid. If we don't have a lot of carbonic acid, we have a high pH. And in the lungs, we don't have a lot of metabolic activity, but there's a lot of airflow, so there's a lower temperature. Now in the body, lungs as well, heart, etc., we have a low partial pressure of oxygen because those tissues are using up all that oxygen. We have a higher partial pressure of CO2 because those tissues are producing those 6 CO2s per every 1 mole of oxygen metabolized, or sugar. Because we have a high CO2, that CO2 is reacting with water to produce carbonic acid, so we get a lower pH, more acidic pH. And because of all this activity, we have a high temperature. Okay, so one of the most amazing things, and I'm going to erase this up here so I have some room. Okay, make sure you have that written down. You can go rewind this if you need to write that down again. Okay. Now, one of the most amazing things about evolution is the way our body evolved myoglobin and hemoglobin to maximize this. Now, let's remember that myoglobin is more for just muscle tissue. So we're going to focus on hemoglobin right now. So what it did is the gene was chunked into 4 polypeptides, and we know that it's got this quaternary structure with these alpha and beta subunits. So we're just going to think of hemoglobin right now as these 4 units right here, okay? And each of the 4 units is capable of binding an oxygen. So what happens is when one oxygen binds to that heme group, okay, remember this is hemoglobin, we can just write hemoglobin. Hemoglobin's a protein. The gene for hemoglobin has 4 different subunits. When one oxygen binds to one subunit, okay, in the lungs, it then increases the affinity of the next subunit, okay, which in turn increases the affinity of oxygen for the next subunit, okay, and then decreases the affinity for the next subunit to kind of mellow the process out. And this process here is called cooperative binding. And it does this so that it's flexible, so that it maximizes the O2. It doesn't bind it all at once, and it doesn't let go of it all at once. It cooperates, those subunits cooperate, and their shape changes as each oxygen binds. And that's a huge reason why hemoglobin evolved to be a quaternary structure-based protein. So what does that look like graphically? Well, let's take a moment here, and I really want to make sure that you pause and you have this down in your notes. This graph is extremely important. I remember when I took the MCAT, the Medical College Admissions Test, the very first question on it was about hemoglobin binding. And the first thing, so first of all, press pause and make sure you write down this. It's got a y-axis, which is percentage of hemoglobin saturated. So this is the amount of oxygen that's actually bound to the hemoglobin. So we started here at 0%, and then at 100% here. So this is oxygen saturation to hemoglobin. So think of this y-axis here as the amount, the raw amount of hemoglobin that's bound to the alpha and beta subunits, or I'm sorry, oxygen that's bound to the alpha and beta subunits of hemoglobin, okay? And then think about this x-axis is tracing the partial pressure of oxygen itself, right? So we said in the lungs we have a high partial pressure. That would be over here, okay? And we said in the body we have a lower partial pressure. Okay, so what are the implications of having a lower and a higher partial pressure of oxygen, okay, with respect to hemoglobin binding? So the first thing I want you noticing when you've drawn this is that we don't have this straight curve. We have this sigmoidal shape. And this sigmoidal shape really represents that cooperative binding, and it gives it this flexibility. So let's trace it, okay? When the partial pressure of oxygen, okay, is very, very, very low down here, we don't have a lot of oxygen bound to hemoglobin. That makes sense. But as the partial pressure starts to increase in the lungs, okay, the amount of hemoglobin that's bound to it starts to increase exponentially in this region right here, okay? And that increase, that exponential increase is happening because of the cooperative binding of those subunits, okay? So remember, when one oxygen binds, it facilitates the binding of the other oxygen and the other oxygen. So that's what you're seeing in this region right here. You're seeing that cooperative binding. So not a lot of oxygen, one binds, and then boom, it facilitates the binding of the others. And then you get to this region right here, and the binding starts to slow down. Okay, so the sigmoidal shape is a graphical representation of the cooperative binding. Now we saw with myoglobin it was just one tertiary structure, so it couldn't exhibit this cooperative nature. Hemoglobin, and the hemoglobin gene specifically, has messenger RNA that really has been segmented into these alpha beta subunits to allow for this cooperative binding. Okay, so that's great, and that's really, really important. So let's look at that a little bit closer. Okay, so let's just trace oxygen right now. Where the partial pressure of oxygen is high, such as in the lungs, boom, we have a high saturation, meaning oxygen is bound to hemoglobin. And the reason oxygen is bound to hemoglobin in the lungs is because it needs to grab it in the lungs and deliver it to the body. Okay, so in the lungs, we want hemoglobin attached to the oxygen. We want it bound really tightly, okay? Now, when you get into the body, the partial pressure of oxygen starts to naturally drop, okay? And it's naturally dropping because the body is using oxygen to produce CO2. But here's the catch. If hemoglobin never lets go of the oxygen, the body can't use it, right? So down here, when the oxygen partial pressure is low, let's say 50%, the hemoglobin binding then drops. It doesn't drop fully because of this cooperative binding, but it drops. And then when it gets even lower than that, let's say 25%, then it really starts to drop dramatically. So just like the cooperative binding can facilitate grabbing onto oxygen, the cooperative binding can actually facilitate letting go of oxygen faster. So again, this is this tertiary structure changing based on the environment. So here, where partial pressure is high, that's in the lungs, okay? And where partial pressure is low, that's in the body. And what's the implication? Well, in the lungs, hemoglobin is going to bind it really, really tightly, right up here. But in the body, hemoglobin is not going to bind it really tightly. And why is it not going to bind it tightly? Well, the cells in our body need the oxygen to run Krebs cycle. And if the cells in our body do not have the oxygen, well, where is the oxygen? It's bound to the hemoglobin. So hemoglobin has to grab onto the oxygen in the lungs really tightly and then come down to the body's cells and let go of the hemoglobin. Okay, so what are the implications of that, right? Well, there's some implications of that which is really, 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 really cool. And that has to do with the way that the molecule actually changes in its binding, its natural binding, to actually facilitate this process even more. So check this out. What we see, okay, what we see in the conditions of the lungs, so in the lung conditions. So what are the lung conditions? So the lung conditions, we have a high partial pressure of oxygen. Increase partial pressure of oxygen, which means we have a low partial pressure of CO2. Okay, and what we also have in the lungs, if we have a low partial pressure of CO2, that means we have a really high pH. Okay, and in the lungs also there's not a lot of respiration, so we have a little low temp. So anytime you see conditions like that, okay, this curve does a really unique thing. Okay, the result is this curve does what we call a right shift. Okay, so what that means is you will see this curve shift in this direction. Okay, and I totally messed that up. No, it doesn't. It does the other curve. Erase what I just said. Come on, Ramsey. That doesn't make any sense. It does, and you're all like, Ramsey, I hate you right now. It does a left shift. Okay. So in the lungs, this curve is going to look like this. Lungs. Okay. So why is that? Well, in the lungs, we want it to bind oxygen, right? And we want it to bind oxygen really tight. So the cooperative binding happens, okay? And the curve switches over here. So as you can see, the more it's pushed left, the more oxygen is bound, right? So whereas at a pressure of, let's say, 50 here, there wasn't that much bound, here, now we had like 77%. Now here we have like 85%. So we see, if we map the behavior of hemoglobin, we see an overall shift to the left. We see a shift to the left whenever the partial pressure jacks up, whenever the partial pressure of CO2 drops, whenever the pH increases or the temperature is lower. So we can actually study hemoglobin, and we can do things like put the hemoglobin molecule in some baking soda, which is very basic, and we can see the way its shape changes and it adheres to oxygen. And we actually can study how much oxygen is bound. We can do that with temperature as well. So the conditions of the body, we see the opposite. So in the body, right, we know we have a lower partial pressure of oxygen, okay? And in the body, we have a lower partial pressure of CO2. And in the body, we actually have, I'm sorry, God, what's wrong with me? Higher partial pressure of CO2. And because we have a higher partial pressure of CO2, we have more carbonic acid. And if we have more carbonic acid, we have a lower pH. Okay? And in the body, we have a lot of metabolism, so it's generally hotter. Okay? So what are we going to see in those conditions? Well, if the brain senses that the partial pressure of O2 is low, or if the brain senses that the partial pressure of CO2 is high, okay, or if the brain senses that there's a drop in pH, the blood is more acidic, or if the brain senses that there's overall increase in body temperature, the brain is going to think that the cells need oxygen. They're going to think that you are in the conditions of the body, okay? That hemoglobin is now located in the body, and hemoglobin now needs to drop off oxygen. Okay? If there's a lot of CO2, that means that more oxygen is needed now to even produce more CO2. So what we're going to see here is we're going to see a right shift. if mapping the behavior of hemoglobin. So this is in the body. Okay. And these all have to do with conformational changes. So if I were to say to you, what happens if temperature increases? Boom. So if temperature increased, hemoglobin's quaternary structure will experience a shape change, okay? And that shape change will decrease the cooperative binding so that oxygen is dropped off in the tissues in the body. So in the body, you do not want as much binding as you want in the lungs, because in the body, that oxygen needs to be let go of and given to the body's tissues. If hemoglobin does not let go of it, then the tissues can't breathe. So I want you thinking about it this way. Whenever you have a shift to the right, hemoglobin lets go of the oxygen and the tissues breathe. Whenever you have a shift to the left, hemoglobin grabs onto the oxygen to bring to the tissues, right? So that's a huge issue in science. Anytime you have a change in hemoglobin's binding ability, you have decreased or compromised abilities for the tissues to breathe. Okay, take care.